Hello there, my name is Dr. Corp. I am an associate professor at Texas A&M Commerce, and my research is looking at how student teachers, we call them interns, or might call them teacher candidates, how they did this fall with teaching mathematics in their 2-day-a-week practice of student teaching. So the purpose of the research was to understand how our students were impacted by COVID in the fall, especially with the stay at home or shelter in place orders that were given in March of 2020. So basically our students went home for spring break and never came back. Then we also wanted to see how our student candidates modified their math content, if at all, and then describe how the students felt they were challenged and what they felt they learned during teaching the math lessons during a pandemic. So a little background, our program is a traditional program where students do 2-day-a-week interning in the first semester of their student teaching and then a full 5-day teaching in the second semester. So this study looks at students who started in the fall of 2020 and will graduate in a couple of months in May of 2021. All of our teachers were in place, face-to-face classrooms by the time they implemented their 3-day math lesson segment. And if you heard of EdTPA or have EdTPA in your state, you know that elementary teachers have to teach task 4, which is a 3-day lesson segment. We are piloting this program, so we have some students in each center that were selected for the pilot or self-selected, and everyone is learning about how to teach consecutive math lessons in a segment and analyze the results, look for the patterns of learning, and to reteach. Most of our students were teaching online until September 17th, but by then nearly all students, our teacher candidates, had students in the classroom and still some online. Of course, we did an IRB submission and got approval to send students an invitation for a survey via email to all the candidates of fall 2020. We used Qualtrics to analyze common themes in their answer choices, and then we used frequency charts and for summaries of values that were able to have a yes, no, or maybe. We used comparative pattern analysis to code developing common themes from their written responses. I had a member check for validation who is outside of my department. And again, I used frequency charts and summary of common themes. For participation, we had roughly 120 students who taught in the fall. I say roughly because a couple did not come back in the spring. We had 30 of these participate in the survey, and I chose to cluster them by grade levels. So K2 had 12, 3 through 6 had 15, and we typically don't include 6th and 7th, but because both of them were teaching in the math area, we chose to see what we could describe from their data, but it will be described separately. So the data is described by grade level and overall. So in this presentation, I'm going to look briefly at the survey answers and discuss the implications just from what we know so far. There's a lot more we want to know, and we are hoping to do focus groups and a follow-up survey as they continue teaching this spring and graduate in May. So the first question just asked about what center they were at in grade level. Question 2 asked about what their mentor told them for their students in mathematics. Were they behind? And so we see that 86% said either they were some or very behind. When we break this down by grade level, it makes sense that this is our K that said no, which makes sense because they would not have been in school the previous spring, but we have the rest of them all saying yes, some, or very, and then only 2 saying no in the 3rd through 5th grade, and it was 2 saying yes or somewhat or very, and only 1 saying no in the 6th and 7th, which is interesting. So what does that data tell us? It tells us that even our student candidates picked up on that students were behind or had larger regression than we would expect from the summer, which makes sense and is agreeing with the data that's coming in on the regression of math and reading from the effects of COVID and the pandemic. When we asked the students to talk to their mentor about, or what their mentor said about the mathematical issue, our students are learning about conceptual, procedural, and reasoning to be able to write their lesson plan to include and then analyze all three areas. So we were hoping they could look through this lens and decide where their students were. And we noticed that two-thirds of all students were struggling conceptually based on the perspective of the candidate, and that a large percentage in third through fifth were struggling, even more than two-thirds. And then for procedurally, I'm sorry, I jumped to grade level. That's the next slide. So procedurally was a struggle for many of their students. And then this was really interesting, that reasoning was not thought to be a struggle for 10 of the 30 students, so a third said no. What does this mean for us? It may mean that we need to have students analyze the reasoning before they start. It also means that there may be a big focus on procedural. So when we look at how they're behind by grade level, I kind of play that what do you see, what do you notice to myself. And I notice that by grade level, third through fifth had the biggest issue with conceptual, which is interesting because most concepts, at least for number sense and the foundation for conceptual, are built in K2. And then noticing that the procedural was also high in third through fifth. I'm wondering if these go hand in hand. Again, questions we want to ask as we're able to do focus groups. And then noticing that the reasoning was the reason that was most populous for kinder second teacher candidates. And I would like to know, how did they know the reasoning? Are they not able to verbalize it, or is it a visual, or just based on grades or scores? So interesting data. When we asked the students to explain what their mentor said about the students being behind, we have 14 saying something about not having a physical school to go to or the time missed, which makes sense. We had 6 saying the shift to virtual online learning was the reason for them being behind. 7 mentioned specific skills that were forgotten, and there were 2 or 3 that mentioned multiplication tables, which is a veteran teacher of student teachers. This multiplication table comes up a lot generally, so I just found that interesting. And then the lack of peer and teacher interaction. So implication might be to find ways to have more peer and interaction, especially if they're on the virtual learning. Question 7 said, did you have to change your content? And we have 60% saying somewhat or yes, that they did, which means 40% said no. Did you change your content by grade level? And again, we noticed that kinder would not have changed their content because they hadn't taught the year before. So they're one of these 5. But 4 students said no, they didn't change their content, even though for kinder, there was a high percentage of students that were behind for kinder through second. So that's an interesting implication if maybe we need to do better assessment or to do better alignment with student needs. And then for third through fifth, we have 6 saying no, they did not change their content, even though there was a high number that said students were behind. And then both 6th and 7th grade teachers said yes, they did change their content, which is interesting because one of them said they were not behind. So then we asked if you had to review prior content before teaching your TEKS, and we had 81% saying yes, they did. And then of those, the common themes were reviewing or teaching specific TEKS from the previous grade level, 13 out of 30, reviewing prior knowledge of grade level TEKS, which may just be the parts that they needed to reinforce, where this sounded like it was more complete TEKS were missing. And then 2 had mentioned something about reading, vocabulary, or changing their reading level to match students' ability. My apologies, finger got stuck. We asked them what supports were implemented, and they had the choice of these 6 strategies. Of all of them, the most populous was using small groups for mathematics, which to us was very encouraging. This is one of our co-teaching models. We see it happening in language arts, but we're excited to know that this was a strategy that mentors went to utilize our teacher candidates to have more math small groups. We also saw 19 participating in online games for practice and 13 for specific slide presentations or tutorial. We also had 3 doing take-home activities or games and 2 sending take-home practice sheets for mathematics. When we look at this by grade level, our implications might be to continue with the small group instruction from our department as a co-teaching model and give support specifically for differentiation or for tasks that can encourage mathematical discourse and reasoning. But we were encouraged that these were high. Also noticed that the take-home activities and practice sheets were 3rd to 5th. And I'm wondering if this is tied to that high need for procedural. And we did notice that the online games were higher in the 3rd through 5th than 6th through 7th, which age appropriately, that makes sense. And hopefully you would find in kinder through 2nd, those age appropriate online games would have a lot of conceptual and visual support. When we asked student teachers or teacher candidates about their personal growth, we had these common themes from K2. 42% mentioned something about manipulatives. 30% mentioned something about explicitly explaining, calling it breaking down or step-by-step explaining. We had 3 that talked about adapting. One said creating new strategies, another said more than one way, and the 3rd said new ways of learning. And then again, 2 mentioned using small groups. You might want to read the quote here at the bottom that kind of exhibits their thinking. Being able to examine the patterns of learning and the students' mathematical reasoning helped me see the effectiveness of my teaching firsthand. So their implication here is that this teaching 3 days and then having them examine the pattern of learnings was very helpful for students seeing if their students had mathematical reasoning and to look at their own teaching. From 3rd through 5th grade, it seemed like teacher candidates talked more about themselves. We had 7 that mentioned something about their own self-efficacy. We have 4 that mentioned a struggle to teach virtual while having in-person students at the same time. We had 3 more talking about needing to be explicit or explicitly explaining. And we had 3 talk about hands-on. I thought it was interesting. One talked about manipulatives, models / food. And here's a quote from 4th grade student teacher candidate. So even though I don't love the mention of worksheets, I can see how she's talking about bringing a balance to having something with manipulative models and food, and then also having online to balance that out. From 6th and 7th, I just gave you their quotes because there were only 3 of them. And 2 of them, again, are talking about the design of thing and design of lessons and how to teach virtually and face-to-face. We do work on backward design. That was another implication we'll take away, that's helpful to students to seeing how to build lessons. And then this 3rd one is talking about the virtual having an abundance of online resources and realizing that we can do the manipulatives online as well as in person. We asked the students to see if they could specify the area of growth. And we had a 0 is none, 1 is some, 0 is none, 1 was little, 2 is some, and 3 was a lot. So you can see that conceptual was the least area of growth, and that reasoning was the most, and procedural was right in the middle. So some implications for us is to maybe work on the conceptual more. If we were to have a class dedicated to math methods, we would definitely build this conceptual understanding of key concepts in K-6 mathematics. When we break it down, we see that we had quite a few saying that they were working on the concept themselves, 15 out of 30, so 50%, but more again on the procedures. And look where it says a lot. This is where I was really impressed. Our students said that they grew a lot in their own mathematical reasoning, which makes sense because they had to analyze their students' patterns of learning. And to do that, they have to understand the mathematics very well themselves and be able to reason so they can understand their students' explanations. I thought it was interesting to note what the data does not show. It does not show all students understanding the concept. 15 said that they did not grow on conceptual. 14 said they did not grow in procedural, but only 1 said they did not grow in mathematical reasoning. When breaking down the student-specific growth, you can see it's kind of a little bit here and there. We do notice that the procedural was mostly in the 3rd through 5th grade teacher candidates. An implication of this is that our 3rd through 5th grade candidates are facing procedures in mathematics that they may not have learned when they were in school. And just personally in the last couple of years, having students understand the conceptual first and then the different ways to proceed procedurally has been an area of growth for most students. But we look again at the reasoning and we see that K2 teachers had a lot of reasoning and 3 through 5th grade teachers had the most gain in reasoning, and then all of our 6th and 7th grade teachers as well. Again, an implication is to connect this to analyzing their students' work, looking for eliciting understanding and getting evidence. I think this was a powerful way to help students develop their own mathematical reasoning. So in conclusion, teacher candidates were overwhelmed learning some of the structures and procedures to put in place behind due to the pandemic, but they also understood that students were behind. They noticed that all areas were concerned. Teacher candidates were challenged by this dual teaching, the virtual and students in the classroom, but most noted some personal growth and then that some growth in their own knowledge of mathematics, and 96.6% marked that they grew in their own mathematical reasoning. Thank you for viewing this presentation. If you have questions or comments or suggestions for our future research, we are hoping to interview and offer a survey at the end of May for all our teaching candidates again. This is my email. Thank you for viewing.